Meeting to order. Bienvenue à la 52.
Welcome to the 52nd meeting of the Standing Committee on Indigenous and Northern Affairs.
Meeting today on the unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people.
Today's meeting is taking place in hybrid form. I know that you're very familiar with this approach, so I won't go into the details.
Virtually, I would like to outline a few rules. You may speak in the official language of your choice. Interpretation services are available for this meeting in French, English, and Inuktitut. You have the choice at the bottom of the screen using the little globe icon of either floor, English, or French. Please select your language now, and if interpretation is lost this evening, tell us and we'll stop until we can solve the problem. Before speaking, please wait until I recognize you by name. You know how to mute and unmute yourself. And please, s'il vous plaît, adressez vos interventions.
Please speak to the chair and through the chair.
Speak slowly and clearly so that the interpreters can do their job. With regard to any speaking list, well, I've already got that, so we don't need to talk about that. So, pursuant to Standing Order 108, brackets 2, and the motion adopted by the committee in November, the committee is beginning its study of improving graduation rates for Indigenous students and examining the whole question of Indigenous education from K to K kindergarten all the way through secondary. Today on our panel, as we begin this first session, we have the honor of having President Cassidy Caron of the Métis National Council, who is here with us in person, as well as President Nathan Obed of the Inuit Tapiriit Kanatami, who is accompanied by Jenny Tierney, Director of Policy Advancement at ITK. So welcome to all of you. You're veterans of this committee, so I think you know that we start with you providing a 5-minute introductory opening, and then we go to questions. So if everybody's fine, we'll begin the proceedings right away, and I'd invite President Caron to start it off with opening remarks.
Great. Thank you so much, and thank you to the committee for the opportunity to appear before you today. The Métis National Council and its governing members view education as a lifelong pursuit, and improving graduation rates and successful outcomes for Métis are really key goals of ours. So, of course, I'm here as the president of the Métis National Council, which is the recognized national and international representative of the Métis Nation in Canada since 1983. The Métis National Council is comprised of and receives its mandate from democratically elected leadership within the provincial Métis governments currently within the provinces of Ontario, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and British Columbia. So Métis people have faced historical and ongoing challenges in accessing and succeeding in education due to factors such as systemic discrimination, poverty, and cultural dislocation. Research shows that Métis people tend to have lower educational attainment than non-Indigenous Canadians, with higher rates of high school dropout and lower rates of post-secondary graduation. Métis students also tend to have lower academic performance than non-Indigenous students, with lower scores on standardized tests and lower rates of grade progression. These educational disparities can have significant consequences for Métis individuals and the well-being and prosperity of our communities and nation, including limited employment opportunities and lower incomes, higher crime rates, poorer health, and mortality outcomes. Addressing these disparities requires recognizing and addressing systemic barriers to Métis education, as well as promoting culturally responsive education that recognizes the unique realities of Métis families and values Métis culture and knowledge. Although Canada's Constitution recognizes Métis as one of the Aboriginal peoples of Canada, historically neither federal nor provincial governments have wanted to assume jurisdictional responsibility for Métis, especially with regard to education. As of today, Métis control of Métis K-12 education remains an elusive goal. Even the ability to influence the system to support Métis students continues to be a challenge. For example, the development of a Métis-specific program for K-12 education lags far behind similar programs for other Indigenous peoples. Métis education infrastructure is almost non-existent in the major metropolitan areas within the homeland, and Métis educational resources are often only made possible by diverting resources away from other program areas. In the K-12 system, Métis parents and or guardians are often reluctant to self-identify children because current pan-Indigenous programs do not adequately represent Métis cultural, linguistic, and historical values. Furthermore, our MNC governing members are currently unable to access accurate, disaggregated data on Métis students. In order to improve the educational outcomes for Métis students, we recognize the need to look beyond simply the provincial educational systems themselves. Removing barriers to educational attainment also includes closing socioeconomic gaps that exist between the Métis Nation and non-Indigenous Canadian populations. Currently, the Métis Nation governing members have advanced in the delivery of programs and services with regard to early learning and childcare, as well as supports for post-secondary education and skills and employment training. There remains a clear gap between the two, K-12 education, though much can be done to support the Métis Nation in improving Métis educational outcomes. This year, through our permanent bilateral mechanism with Canada, we agreed to focus one of our priority areas on K-12 education, with a goal of entering into a 10-year Canada-Métis Nation kindergarten to grade 12 education accord to improve education outcomes for Métis Nation students across the Métis homeland. Such an accord would seek federal investment over 10 years to support Métis students and improve Métis educational outcomes. This can be done through the development and implementation of Métis-specific education programs, the development of educational infrastructure, the creation of Métis-specific classroom and teaching resources, as well as at-home educational resources for families, and investments into the professional development of Métis educators so that Métis learners can see themselves reflected in the public education system. Long-term stable funding for our Métis governments to be able to invest in Métis education is essential to ensure that our MNC governing members have the capacity for long-term planning, design, and delivery of education programs that support Métis citizens' goals and priorities. Ultimately, however, we believe that Métis educational outcomes can and will be improved through the recognition of the inherent right of the Métis right to self-government and Métis control over Métis education. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Caron. We'll now go to Mr. Obed for 5 minutes.
Nakomik, thank you, Mr. Chair. Also, it's good to see committee members again. As you implied, I am a regular here, and I always appreciate our conversations. Inuit Tapri Kanatami is the representational voice for Canada's approximately 70,000 Inuit. The majority of our population lives in Inuit Nunangat, which comprises 40% of Canada's landmass and approximately 72% of Canada's coastline. Inuit co-manage or own of that space, and our elected leaders who comprise the board of directors of ITK are the rights holders for that space. They are the Nunatsiavut government, Makivik in Nunavik, Nunavut Tungavik Incorporated, and the Inuvialuit Regional Corporation in the Northwest Territories. The foundation of our modern treaties, our comprehensive land claim agreements, have been a part of the renewal of the relationship between Inuit and the Crown, but not completely. And education falls outside of the boundaries of most of our land claim agreements, but not all, which then requires us to do more meaningful work with the federal government in the area of K-12, of early learning, of post-secondary, and lifelong learning. The state of neglect after a century of unpredictable approaches for governing education in Inuit Nunangat.
Monsieur le Président.
I'm sorry, Chair. I'm very sorry to interrupt, but I'm not hearing the interpreter at present.
We'll just interrupt for a second to try to reestablish the English.
I can now hear the interpreter.
J'entends maintenant l'interprète.
I can now hear the interpreter. I'm sorry.
Marché.
Good. All's well.
The state of neglect is palpable in the outcomes. Our outcomes are still quite different than the rest of Canadians. but also then the generations of unpredictable relationships for education and underfunding or complete abandonment of responsibilities has led to scenarios perhaps like the Governor General of this country, who grew up in Quebec, but because of Quebec policies, was not offered education in French. She ultimately is trying to learn that language now, but it highlights just the unacceptable realities that Inuit have faced over time and the ongoing systemic racism and lack of respect for our lived realities when we come into scenarios where we are asserting ourselves and our aspirations through higher roles within this country. For years, the federal government has maintained that it does not have jurisdiction over any aspect of education in Inuit communities, despite exercising jurisdiction within areas of First Nations education, such as through the provision of funding for First Nations language education. The Indian Act is but one instrument of the relationship between the Crown and First Nations Inuit and Métis. Inuit do not fall under the Indian Act and therefore have been treated very differently when it comes to programs and policies over the life of Canada. Indigenous Services Canada provides funding to First Nations through interim regional funding formulas and transformative education agreements. While this funding may not have originally stemmed from the recognition of Section 35 rights to Indigenous education, this funding now contributes to its implementation. The lack of Inuit to be able to access similar funds also is a gap that needs to be fixed. Just as specific funding and self-government education agreements have been necessary measures to meet the Crown's obligations with respect to First Nations education, so too are measures needed to meet the Crown's obligations with respect to Inuit education. Canada has now recognized the right to Indigenous education in various forums, including Section 35 of the Constitution and international instruments. These rights belong to all Indigenous peoples of Canada. As an outcome of the 2009 Inuit Education Accord, which was an agreement between the Government of Canada and Inuit Taprik Kanatami, ITK released the National Strategy on Inuit Education in 2011, which was guided by a vision to graduate bilingual Inuit children with the skills and knowledge to contribute with pride and confidence in their homes and with home communities and within Canada in the 21st century. This strategy outlined 10 recommendations that should have been undertaken to improve educational outcomes for Inuit, which included strengthening K-12, investing in post-secondary education, the establishment of a university in Inuit Nunangat, and policies to increase the number of Inuit educators. However, since the signing of the Accord and the release of the strategy, there has been little movement on graduation rates for Inuit. StatsCan data from 2018 indicate that only 34% of Inuit in Inuit Nunangat are graduating with a high school diploma, and this is an increase of only 9% from 2009 StatsCan figures. At the same time, the national graduation rate has risen from 75% in 2009 to 86% in 2018. Major legislative and policy gaps continue to limit access to quality education among Inuit students. Inuit are one of the fastest growing populations in this country, and the crisis we still face today in education will only grow if there continues to be a failure to act. I appreciate that we have done some work in relation to early childhood or post-secondary funding in the last 5 to 7 years, but transformative acts need to happen, and also the federal government must get over the fear that it has to exert its jurisdiction and its place within the role of Inuit education moving forward. Nakomik, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Obed. We'll now proceed with the first round of questions, beginning with Mr. Zimmer for 6 minutes.
Thank you both and all three for appearing at INAN today to talk about education. It's something that's very important to me. I'm a former high school teacher, and former coach, a varsity coach too. So education is, it's all about coaching to me, and it's about learning. And I wouldn't be here today if I didn't have my 2 degrees and the opportunities that it's given me. So it's huge. I'm going to start off with Natan, and hopefully I said that right, finally. So I have an article from a while ago, and it's, you probably read it. It's got 17 little-known facts about Natan Obed. You probably remember from 2016. But I could really relate to one of your passions, and it's listed in number 14. So there's a whole bunch. If you want to get to know Mr. Obed a little bit better, just look it up. It's on it's a Hill Times article. But number 14, especially on education, it says, if you could get the answer to any question, what would it be? Was asked of you, and you said, how do we create an education system across Inuit, Nunangat, that produces Inuktitut English grade 12 graduates grounded in our culture and ready for any post-secondary program in the world? Very cool goal. I mean, how could you not ask for more for the next generation? And you explained a little bit more sort of the macro, the problems about maybe some systemic issues that are maybe still in the system. But give me some examples about how we can get from where it is now, because you brought up the graduation rates are there's still, we applaud the ones that have graduated, and that's a real positive, but we want to get better. So maybe just to explain some of what your vision would look like, some of the changes, what would it look like if you could implement them today?
Thank you for the question, and you never know when things you say in public or to media will come back to you. So here we are. I still have that as one of the key foundational goals that I have and reasons for doing the work that I do. Empowering Inuit and creating strong, capable Inuit. And the term in Inuktitut is for this type of pedagogy is inunguinik, which is the creation of strong, capable people who are then ready to be adults in their community and in the world. It starts with a cultural foundation. It starts with early learning and childcare opportunities. And then within the K-12 system, the pedagogy is often borrowed from jurisdictions like Alberta, for especially when you get into grade 9 to 12. And there's a natural setup where Inuktitut, or Inuktitut broadly across Inuit Nunangat, and also our culture is set up against the pedagogy of and the requirements of K-12 education systems that then are prerequisites to go on to anything else. And so often our educators and those who run our education authorities have had to make really tough decisions about not being aspirational, but just hoping that we can get enough of the prerequisites to allow for our students to have transferable degrees. On the other hand, there are so many social issues, whether it be food insecurity, a lack of housing, that also are tremendous factors in the ability for our students to come to school ready to work. In our pre-budget submission this year, we have put in a 15-year proposal for a school food program that would allow for Inuit students to not have to worry about getting meals and would allow for them to be more focused in the classroom and to have more food security in their lives. We do hope that that is something that the federal government considers. But it is an overarching approach, and it needs people in communities who can be leaders in education systems and find their path. It also needs the Canadian government and Canadian institutions to fully accept and recognize Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous culture and language as adequate prerequisites to build into then the structures that allow for children to then proceed beyond grade 12. And it also requires the funds to be able to bring us into a better position in relation to the rest of the country.
So with that, and you've given a really I think there's a lot of conversations around, culture being part of the education process. And one thing, as a former teacher, I'd written programs myself, and you'd see this, well, we've always done it that way, so we're just going to keep doing it that way, even though it doesn't really work very well. So I guess I would ask you back, do you think, based on what you just said too, do you think you have enough structure in place, or not? Structure is maybe not the right word, the right people, the right sort of forward-thinking educators in Nunavut to really kind of take that challenge and are ready to go ahead with this? They're just lacking funds or lacking different things? Or do you think that still has to be established, that sort of the view of the vision for the future?
I believe there are amazing educators and amazing people in Inuit Nunangat who are striving for the best of their students, whether they are in early learning all the way up through post-secondary. I think the systemic challenges within our systems, one, come to do with the system as a whole itself. It just isn't comprehensive enough. In many small communities, there are not ways for a student to get all of the prerequisites to be able to go to post-secondary. So there are many of our students who have to then come to the south or come to regional centers just to be able to finish a grade 12 education, no matter how capable they are, in order to then start with post-secondary.
To get to a regional center isn't just 10 minutes down the road. It's hours and hours on a plane to get there. Right?
It could be within an 800-kilometer or 1,000-kilometer radius where you could have a regional center versus a center where there's 300 to 500 people who live in it.
Yeah.
So it is the scaling of this project. In many cases, Inuit communities didn't provide high school until the 1970s and 1980s. We still have a very new educational system, which is a detriment in some ways, but it is also an opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
Things crystallize very quickly, and administrative structures and ways to do business crystallize, but still there is a malleability in our systems, but there's ultimately a lack of outcome. And I think it's unacceptable, and I think all Canadians should find it unacceptable.
Yeah, hear.
And I don't think that our students are any less bright than any other Canadian students. I think the opportunities to get a quality education and then the opportunities to move wherever they want to go in the world, those are the challenges that we need to address head on.
Agreed and well said. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Zimmer. Ms. Atwin, over to you for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to my committee colleagues and, of course, our distinguished guests who are very much regulars, and we love to see them. I just want to say to everyone, this is what I've been looking forward to, is this specific study. This is exactly why I got involved in politics to begin with. So I'm very excited for this important conversation that we're having. I also came from an education background, so I think that's really great to learn that about you as well, Mr. Zimmer. I work specifically with Indigenous students in the province of New Brunswick. And I mean, so many things. What led me here was because of the barriers that were being experienced by my students, by the community, by our education directors, by the chiefs, just constantly being frustrated and feeling not supported. And actually, directly before coming to this place, I did an education study. It took 2 years, and we studied on-reserve education, so it would be elementary schools in particular, in comparison to our provincial schools. And what I found in the study was schools that had strong language and culture initiatives had higher attendance rates, had higher literacy and numeracy outcomes. But the biggest indicator was actually school food programs. So looking after, basic needs, ensuring that, students had what they needed to be able to function for the day and to be able to be healthy and whole was one of the most important indicators. And the other big piece, again, was also, representation. So seeing other Indigenous teachers, administrators, education assistants in the rooms with them, being there. That representation is so important. So I know I only have 6 minutes. I could talk about this for hours. I'm very passionate. But I'll start, I think, with President Caron. What are you seeing in your communities as far as that representation? How's the engagement on language and culture initiatives, and how do you see that impacting your students?
So at this point, it's not great. The indigenization of the curriculum that is taking place within the provincial governments throughout the Métis Nation homeland is actually excluding excluding our Métis governments, and they're not engaging with our Métis governments in a meaningful way to actually be able to do this. So our Métis governments are the rightful representatives of Section 35 rights-bearing Métis people, no matter where they live in these provinces, and they're the ones that are there to advocate on behalf of these people to change these systems to make it so that it is representative for these students. Unfortunately, we see an easy way out for indigenization of curriculum where a pan-Indigenous approach is taken, and it often does not reflect Métis-specific culture. The Michif language is not taught in many schools, with the exception of some in Saskatchewan, and a language program that is taking place there, or just starting to get off the ground. But when we do see those Michif programs that are being taught in the younger years, the early learning and childcare systems or programs that our governments are putting in place, we're seeing these children thrive. And then we have the programs and supports for the students when they get to post-secondary education, but it's that middle K-12 area where they do get left behind. So they're learning their language, they're learning their culture, they're being engaged in these early learning and childcare systems. And then when they go to university, they also have those same supports, but it's that middle piece that's really being missed. And the engagement that we're seeing right now it's non-existent, and that is why we are advocating for investments for our Métis governments to be able to develop these programs, these supports on their own, and then be able to put them into the systems to be able to support Métis people.
Very much. Something in New Brunswick that worked really well, because we were seeing similar things happening, that, the provincial government wasn't living up to its responsibilities for provincial schools, chronic underfunding for on-reserve schools. So there were specific agreements that were put in place. And I will say we saw major, dividends from those agreements as far as empowering the communities to make decisions for themselves, to hire, to put people, again, the representation piece in the schools. And so President Obed, you mentioned as well, because some of the transformative education agreements. Can you speak to how important they are and kind of what they look like in your territory?
Well, I'll start with the work that we've tried to do with the federal government, starting in 2008 or so, when Inuit were wanting to create a national Inuit strategy on education. We brought the federal government along with provinces and territories and all education authorities together to try to come up with a terms of reference or a path forward for improving educational outcomes for K-12 Inuit students and also for post-secondary. The accord that was signed was meant to be a starting point where we were so excited for the possibility of further federal funding for specific targeted interventions that would only be appreciated by educational authorities that were Inuit specific, that allowed for culture and language, or for greater access to social programs, or specific accreditation standards, especially for when it comes to teacher attainment and teacher accreditation, that would allow for more Inuit to come into the program, or the school program, or in post-secondary. And we built our national strategy around this idea that we could transform the system, and that all jurisdictions would be with us. Ultimately, people retreat back into the status quo, and it's very easy to do that. And also, for a federal government, I can understand how hard it is to get into a space that a province or territory has deemed its own, even if it does not do a very good job with it. If you look at our educational attainment and you look at the infrastructure in our communities for education in relation to other communities, it's obvious there's a massive deficit. But transforming that space and allowing any partner who wants to help is not necessarily what we have experienced. So we still remain hopeful, and through the Inuit Crown Partnership Committee, we do have a structure where education and early learning is a priority within the bilateral space between Inuit leadership and the Crown. But we are still struggling with that basic idea of what is possible and how much is the federal government willing to put itself in a difficult scenario for Inuit children. And this question is not just in education. It's also in relation to housing. It's also in relation to the implementation of UNDRIP. These are really hard spaces for the federal government to do because it bleeds into relationships with jurisdictions that in some cases will go hard in other areas if they do not like what the federal government is doing in relation to this area of Indigenous people.
Merci, Madame Atwin.
Thank you, Ms. Atwind. Now we will go to Ms. Gill for 6 minutes. Thank you, Chair. I again thank all our witnesses. I must say that I, too, am interested in this topic. I am from collegiate level, college level education in Quebec, and I was involved in literature. So when I hear our witnesses, I must say that I'm very sensitive to what they have to say to us today. Teaching culture, teaching language, and teaching Indigenous students, Innu students in my writing. I was able to see the difficulties that students were up against, the obstacles they faced. Even though we do try to push forward by teaching literature that was available in their language, even though it was also available in French, well, I saw this over the years. And Mr. Aubin has mentioned this, the difficulties that pile on one after the other. Not that Québécois students don't have difficulties as well, but these are extra difficulties due to being far from home. Mr. Obed has mentioned this, the fact that students can't necessarily study where they're from. I had students who would come from 800 kilometers away, for example. So I would like Ms. Caron and Mr. Obed to tell us how this affects a number of sectors. You've mentioned education, but also housing. Now, this is a matter related to children, the family, cultural grounding. Basically, I'm going to leave it to you to tell me what is needed to do better. I would have also liked to talk about a specific college in Quebec, but I'll get back to that in a second round.
Caron start, and then Mr. Obed.
Sure. Thank you for the question. If I understood, the question was just simply what more could be done to do better. I think it just comes down to simple investments in education for Indigenous students and for us, for Métis students. We have always seen significant underfunding for Métis programs and services. There's always been that jurisdictional, like we like to say, the jurisdictional hot potato between provincial governments and the federal government for so long with regard to, who takes responsibility for the Métis. In 2016, of course, there was the Supreme Court decision, Daniels decision, and it was deemed that Métis people are, of course, the responsibility of the federal government. There has been significantly slow uptake in changing programs and services and investments for the Métis Nation since 2016. Indigenous Services Canada still has a number of programs and services that were established before 2016 and still carry on today that leave out the Métis Nation. They are still labeled Indigenous programs, but they are just specifically First Nations and Inuit. And we see that all across the country now as it relates to education. So investments into education, Métis-specific programs and services that can support Métis students is going to help. Ms. Gill, you spoke about some of those barriers that a lot of our people face. There's still we need the recognition that, children need safe homes to be able to then feel safe to go to school. Those socioeconomic gaps that exist between the Métis Nation and non-Indigenous Canadians, those affect the outcomes, the educational outcomes for the Métis Nation. So everything that we are doing to close socioeconomic gaps is going to help the educational outcomes for Métis students. And we know that with the investment into education, we're investing into these children's futures. With more education, they have higher education, they can earn a higher income. That lowers crime rates, that lowers the cost on the healthcare system. There are so many studies into investments into education paying off for the Canadian economy, and with our large Métis population, I can only imagine how that translates. So investments into Métis education will only support this country.
I'll focus just exclusively on Inuktitut, just in the response to your question. First, to say that anybody who you interact with that is fluent in Inuktitut, that does their work in Inuktitut, that just like Lori Idlout here, who chooses to work in Inuktitut here in this committee, these are in-kind gifts to the country. No education system, no formal education system has created an Inuktitut speaker in this country. Even though you have a jurisdiction like Nunavut, where there's an 85% majority of Inuit, the mother tongue of the jurisdiction is Inuktitut. But the education systems do not create grade 12 level speaking Inuktitut speakers. The community does that. Your family does that. And the same thing in Nunavik. 99% of all people from Inuit from Nunavik speak Inuktitut as their mother tongue. These are incredibly resilient languages, but you can see how difficult it would be to go to school in your second or third language and expect to just plow ahead as if that is just normal, and also to leave your mother tongue behind forcefully. And also, like my sons went to Inuktitut daycare. They went to the Inuktitut stream through grade K-4. Now they're in grades 10 and 8. Since grade 4, they have not learned anything in our education system about Inuktitut. They have gone through remedial language arts classes that allow for them to still maintain a bit of their language. But certainly it isn't the educational pedagogy to graduate them as Inuktitut speakers. This is one of the fundamental problems that we just don't address. We tried to address it through the Indigenous Languages Act. We have tried to get Inuktitut as an official language in Inuit Nunangat, but we have not been successful yet. We need transformative change in relation to the recognition of Inuktitut, to be able to educate our children and to give them a chance to build upon their mother tongue to be successful in their educational journey.
Merci, Madame Gill.
Thank you, Ms. Gill. We will now hear from Ms. Idlout for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, Mr. Chairperson. Firstly, I wish to welcome the speakers here. I see you all, and I'm happy to see you. And your presentation are very helpful. We need to understand. I haven't been in education in English all my life. Nathan said, in our own homes, I speak Inuktitut. I can retain it if I speak it at home. But we also know that because I went to an English school all my life, up to grade 12, and twice in university, all that I learned was in English. When I speak my own mother tongue, I am happy. Many people, many Inuit, haven't. I know that I do not have I'm not a fluent Inuit speaker because it hasn't been taught. I want to know if education will also think of our young people who will not grow up in the educational system like us. I am happy that I was able to be educated in English, but I had to leave my culture. I don't know how to sew traditional clothes. I do not know how to prepare sealskins or light a khullik. I could have learned those life skills if I had learned my mother tongue. I want to learn those. I want to learn what I was supposed to learn in my mother tongue. I encourage people, young people who are going to school now and who are working with Indigenous people and other Canadians. I know I would like to see that we have an option in Canada to learn 2 languages of our choice. Cassidy and Natan can respond. The Truth and Reconciliation recommendations, number from 52 to 65, it encourages all governments, federal, provincial, territorial, and local governments, how they can be more supportive. Why is it that none of those recommendations are being implemented? From 62 to 65, especially those recommendations. Thank you.
Shall we start with Ms. Caron and then Mr. Obed?
Sure. Thank you, and it's great to see you, Lori. As I know many of the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action, but I don't know the specific numbers around them. Lori, are those specifically around education?
Yes, it's regarding education. And these are recommendations to improve education for Indigenous people to learn their culture and their language. And that funding should be a resource to make it happen.
I mean, I can only imagine that once again the challenges come down to whose jurisdiction is implementing these recommendations. If it is on the provincial government to implement these within their educational systems, or if it is upon the federal government to implement the Truth and Reconciliation calls for action. Once again, we aren't seeing throughout the Métis Nation the implementation of Métis-specific programs within the education system. There's just simply no uptake outside of our own educational authorities, or, like I say, the early learning and child care programs that our Métis governments are delivering on their own. We struggle to have that recognition within the provincial governments that we are seeing right now, and we will continue to see that. That pan-Indigenous approach to this, though, it just does not work for our children. It is teaching Métis students different ways of knowing that aren't coming from our own communities. But I think I'll leave it at that. It's that jurisdictional challenge that we continue to face. However, our Métis governments, we have the ability to develop these programs, these services for our children. While we don't have the ability to learn the Michif language in the provincial education system. Our Métis governments have the resources to be able to do that. Lori, as you said, you didn't have an education in your own language, but you could go home and you could speak it there. Our focus is on these early learning and childcare centers where these young people are learning their language at a really young age, and then giving the parents the resources to be able to continue that on at home, because we do know that gap is going to exist once they enter into kindergarten and the ongoing years. So the resources, again, to be able to do that from our Métis governments, to be able to deliver it into our families, that's right now what our best bet is, to be able to do this in a good way.
Specifically in relation to the calls to action, there are a number of things that we had hoped to do with Canadian educators and in Canadian educational systems to ensure that there was a distinctions-based approach to the way in which curricula are developed. Unfortunately, jurisdictions aren't very good at going to rights holders all the time. Often, if there's an individual that they know, perhaps who then will happily take that space, then curricula are developed with an individual perspective about a people's rather than an official perspective from representatives of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. So that is not necessarily about the children growing up in our communities, but it is about the way Canadians perceive the residential school experience, and also the way that Canadians understand Inuit, First Nations, and Métis realities. When it comes to the funding of an education system, and specifically to provide more and to be more open to increasing educational outcomes and attainments, we still are in that phase of building towards investments and ambition. Again, I'll go back to our educational attainment rates. We are over 50% lower in graduating our young students from grade 12 than other Canadians. It is unacceptable, and we need to figure out how to solve this. Yes, this committee conversation is great, but certainly it is a crisis within this country, and there are very strong pedagogical ways in which we can improve existing systems that categorically would give our students a better chance to succeed. There isn't these mystical problems that we have no solutions for. Give students food to eat. Give them the courses that they need to graduate. Allow for culture and language within the curriculum and celebrate that, and allow for that to be the foundation on which they can go out into the rest of the country and pursue further educational attainment. Provide the educational program in our mother tongue. Not hard, but somehow we've made it impossible.
Thank you, Ms. Laut. We have about 10 minutes left, so I'm going to suggest three minutes, 3 minutes, 2 minutes, and 2 minutes for the first four. So we'll start with Mr. Malilo for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to my fellow committee members, and of course to our two witnesses who we know very well. I really appreciate the conversation we've had today, and the you've given us a lot to think about already. I really appreciate it. I'll start with President Caron, but President Obed, if you want to jump in at any point, please do. I really appreciated, President, you talked about obviously the barriers that exist, the low graduation rates, lower scores for Métis students, but you also spoke about the need for a broader structure to support particularly some more culturally appropriate education. And that really struck home for me. So I represent Northwestern Ontario, part of the Métis homeland, also 42 First Nations across 3 treaty territories. And I think for a lot of people in my region, when they talk about Indigenous education, they think about education on reserve, and that's it. Obviously, education on reserve is very important, but I would agree with you that, like you mentioned, that there's a need for a lot greater support in the provincial and in the public systems. and part of that, we've started to see that in my writing as well, where Ojibwe is now being taught as a second language. For example, that's something that is relatively new that started when I was still in school. So I'm going to stop there because I'm going to eat up all of my time, but I want to hear from you, President Caron, if you can speak more specifically to some of the cultural aspects that you feel should be included and that will make a difference for Métis people in order to advance that education in the public school system.
Honestly, it's as simple as the recognition that there are 3 distinct Indigenous people in this country. There's still a lot of Métis people who don't even self-identify, or their parents don't self-identify them in these systems because then they are taught somebody else's culture. So just the ability for educators to know that there are 3 distinct Indigenous people, that we have our own culture, our own language, our own history, our own stories, that recognition matters. I think it starts as simple as that, and then to be able to have educators understand that there are unique resources for Métis students, that, there are Michif resources, the language of the Métis people, not the only language that, our Métis people speak Cree, they speak Dene, they speak many different dialects of the Michif language. To know the stories of the Métis Nation, to know where we come from, who we are, why we are so proud to be who we are, those things matter. It's fantastic to be able to learn about other people's cultures, of course, and that's really important, especially if you are, in a neighboring First Nations community, and your colleagues, your classmates are coming from different cultures. It's important to learn about that, but it's also important for that student, that Métis student, to also feel like they are being honored and they can be proud of who they are, and that they can be proud to teach their classmates about who they are. And when their teacher knows who they are and where they come from, the language that they speak, those things are just so important. So that distinctions-based recognition, it just seems so simple, but it's just not there.
Appreciate it. I'm going to assume.
Thank you, Mr. Malilo. Now we'll go to Mr. McLeod. Mr. McLeod, you will have 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the presenters. Education is a big part of our discussions whenever we talk about self-determination, self-governance, and many of our nations here in the North have focused a lot on post-secondary investment so that they can provide some more support, whether it's tutors or, just being able to adjust to living in the South. But the results that we're hearing, or the feedback that we're getting, is that that's not good enough. That's not good enough in terms of providing support for people to just get to that point, and we need to look at complete wraparound support right from the time a girl is going to have a baby, especially if there's no family around, there's no grandmother or somebody there to advise them on making healthy choices. And so we could have babies that are born without being affected by FAS or FAE or other issues, because there's no program that can fix that. So when we talk about education, it starts very, very early, right from the time the mother is expecting a child. Can you maybe both of you just give a little bit of how you see that as we talk about education in terms of having good outcomes?
Ms. Caron, and then Mr. Obed.
Sure. Thank you, Minister. I couldn't agree more. When I say that the Métis Nation looks at education as a lifelong pursuit, we really do mean that it starts from birth, being able to provide parents with the ability to raise this child in a good way, in a good home, give that person everything that they need to be able to then go into the early learning and childcare programs that we are able to deliver. children need supports all throughout their life to be able to get to post-secondary education. Like I say, the investments that we have seen through the Métis Nation right now, we have early learning and childcare, and we have post-secondary. How do we expect these children to carry on what they have picked up in these early learning and childcare centers, and then kind of make their way through K to 12 as successful as they were as little children and make it into post-secondary? We need the continuous supports for children to get to post-secondary. And then, of course, from there as well, what's next? The different employment opportunities to be able to still be part of the Métis Nation, specifically in our case. How do we create jobs that are going to contribute to the Métis economy? We're thinking about this lifelong journey of a Métis person from birth up until death. And you're right, it takes wraparound supports, but it takes that continuous thinking of how do we get somebody from birth until death and make sure that they have everything that they need to be successful. Right now for the Métis Nation, the glaring gap is within the K to 12 education system.
At ITK, we've worked quite hard on early learning and childcare. We released a framework in 2018, and we will share that with the committee members. We will also be sharing our National Inuit strategy on education as well. To your point, though, Michael, in the space of early learning, we've said, so many people have said from our culture that children need to be safe. Children need to be loved. Children need to be connected to their language and culture. That is that foundation that allows for then the children to go into the world and experience and learn in the world in the healthiest, most productive way. We still have a long way to go to ensure that there are, as somebody had said earlier, those wraparound services to ensure that guardians and parents and whoever is in that circle of care for a young child have the ability to pave that path for that child to have those three things: to be safe, to be loved, and to be connected to their family and their community.
Thank you, Mr. Obed. Madame Gill, vous avez 2 minutes.
Ms. Gill, you have 2 minutes. Thank you, Chair. A little earlier, I mentioned the example of the CUNA College in Odanak in Quebec in an Abenaki community, a college which is dedicated to young Indigenous people. A short break. We seem to have a problem with the interpretation.
No, sorry, that was my own fault. I had to switch it to original when I was back to English.
Okay, no problem. Continuez, s'il vous plaît, Madame Gill.
Please continue, Ms. Gill. Thank you, Chair. Yes, please go ahead. Oh, good, thank you. A pleasure to repeat this for my colleague, Laurie, as well. I was saying that I have mentioned a college, which is a good example in Quebec, at least I believe so, which works with Indigenous students. It's a higher education institution, a college, CEGEP level, in an Indigenous community. To get more information here in the committee, I'm just wondering, Mr. Obed, Ms. Caron, whether you have any examples, keeping in mind, of course, the lack of funding for the Métis Nation and many other problems you've underscored, but do you have any examples of institutions that are doing well, that are offering good services, perhaps in your own communities or perhaps even outside of Canada, serving other Indigenous communities around the world? I'd like to hear your examples.
Would you like to start, Ms. Caron?
We do have, I guess, higher education learning institutions that are Métis specific. They're not necessarily post-secondary institutions, but they are higher education learning institutions that are Métis specific. So, for example, in Saskatchewan, we have the Gabriel Dumont Institute. It's an institution that is Métis run. They develop and deliver Métis specific learning tools and a bunch of different programs and services. In the province of Alberta, we have the Rupert's Land Institute as well. Those are really great examples of Métis-specific learning institutions that I think this committee should absolutely take a look at. They're doing some really incredible things, and I love the opportunity to go and visit those institutions and learn more myself even. So I would highly recommend having a look at Rupert's Land Institute and Gabriel Dumont Institute.
Thank you. Mr. Abed?
Yes, across Inuit Nunangat and wherever Inuit live, there are arrangements between Inuit organizations or Inuit jurisdictions and southern jurisdictions for particular programs, such as a law program or an education, a Bachelor of Education or a Master's in Education. So there are one-offs, and usually there are service agreements or arrangements between jurisdictions and southern institutions. We are hoping to break free of that model as the only model. We are in the process of creating an Inuit Nunangat University. Our board has mandated us to pursue the development of that university. That was in 2017. We hope by the end of this year we will have a full-scale model proposed to our board for us to then go into that next phase of creating the institution. It would be the first university in Inuit Nunangat if it is created. Although there are many programs and universities courses that Inuit students can avail themselves of, it always is with a southern-based institution, and many times it demands that those students learn at least partially in the south. So we hope to provide another avenue to success, along with the already many different avenues that Inuit students can take to be successful in post-secondary.
Thank you. Merci, Madame Gill. Ms. Sidlaut, you can sort of close us down after 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. I have a question for Natan. You mentioned that the agreement you had, the education agreement you had with the Crown. I was very happy to hear that. Can you talk a little more about that? Why is it not implemented now? Can you give us a copy of the strategy or the study?
Lori, we will add the accord to the list of materials that we will provide to the committee. The accord was signed in anticipation of the release of the national strategy on education. Immediately, there were jurisdictional fights between the federal government and PT jurisdictions about the federal government's involvement in any of this. And I believe that the federal government has retreated a bit in its ambition. We've seen a renewal of that interest in working in the Inuit educational space by this government, but we certainly have not achieved the outcomes of the accord in the way that we had hoped and the way that the words jump out at you on the page. As I said in my remarks earlier, there is a nonsensical policy divide in this country about the things that the federal government does for particular groups of Indigenous peoples in education and the things it doesn't do for others. Especially when we look at outcomes and the outcomes for all First Nations, Inuit, and Métis in this country, we want them to be on par with the rest of Canadians. We want to build systems that work, and sometimes that means that we go through uncomfortable places to get there, and we get beyond politics and into the care of the students of this country. So I'm happy to provide more information and to have further conversations with you, Lori, about these particular issues when we have a moment to speak.
Thank you, Ms. Hidlout. With that, this wraps up our panel. I would like to thank Ms. Caron, Mr. Obed, Ms. Tierney for coming at pretty short notice as we launch this. We have many more sessions on the issue of education, but you've given us a very good high-level view of the situation with some specific examples as well. So we very much appreciate your testimony today. Thank you very much. And with that, we are adjourned.